Maplewood was one of those neighborhoods where nothing ever out of the ordinary happened. The neatly manicured lawns, rows of pastel-colored houses, and occasionally yapping dogs behind a white picket fence made this neighborhood picture perfect. It was on that cool spring morning when something unusual started to unwind, a thing that would shake off the serenity, a thing that was to ripple across the community with utter disbelief. 3-year-old Tommy was a whirlwind of energy and a real happy-go-lucky, but over the past week, he had developed this weird quirk. Every morning, as soon as his mom, Sarah, opened the front door, Tommy would toddle down the driveway, pointing at the neighbor's trash can and bursting into tears. And not just any tears, like guttural, heart-wrenched sobs that left her baffled and embarrassed in equal measure. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Grady," she apologized one morning as the elderly neighbor stepped out to retrieve his paper. "I have no idea why he's doing this." Mr. Grady, a wiry man with thick glasses and a permanent scowl, huffed in irritation. "Control your child," he snapped. "There's nothing in my trash can but garbage." Sarah bit her lip, hauling a still-crying Tommy back inside. But as the days passed, Tommy's outbursts became more insistent. He would tug at Sarah's sleeve, pointing toward the trash can with wide, tear-filled eyes as if trying to warn her about something only he could see. "He's just going through a phase," Sarah told herself, but couldn't shake the unease that was beginning to creep into her thoughts. What in the world could be so upsetting about an old garbage can? Across the street, Officer Mike Dawson, a young cop with a knack for solving unusual cases, watched the commotion with growing curiosity. He could see quite clearly from his porch into the Grady residence and the bizarre daily scene unfolding in the driveway. "What do you make of it?" he asked his wife, Lisa, over breakfast one morning. Lisa glanced out the window. "Maybe the kid's just scared of the trash can. Who knows what goes through a toddler's mind?" Mike frowned. "It's more than fear. He's pointing at it, like he's trying to tell us something." "You're overthinking it," Lisa replied, rolling her eyes. "You're a cop, Mike. Not everything's a mystery to solve." But Mike couldn't let it go. That afternoon, he walked over to the Grady house under the pretense of a friendly chat. Mr. Grady answered the door, his usual scowl firmly in place. "What do you want?" Grady barked. "Just checking in," Mike said casually. "Anything unusual going on?" Grady narrowed his eyes. "Unless you count nosy neighbors and screaming brats, no." Mike smiled wryly and glanced back towards the notorious bin, the lid set firmly in its place. But as he now started to walk away, a sudden faint smell, acrid and metallic, persisted. The next morning, Sarah had had enough. Tommy's wails had reached a fever pitch, and no amount of comforting seemed to soothe him. Desperate for answers, she decided to confront the trash can herself. Steeling her nerves, she grabbed a pair of gloves and marched across the street. Mr. Grady was on his porch, sipping his coffee. "What are you doing?" he demanded as Sarah approached the can. "I need to check something," she said firmly. "Tommy won't stop crying, and I think it has something to do with this." Grady snorted. "You're insane." She ignored him and reached for the lid. The stench that hit her was overwhelming as the smell wafted out, and she gagged, stumbling back. But what lay inside twisted her stomach. There, beneath a layer of decaying food and discarded fast food wrapping, something caught a beam of sunlight. Sarah reached inside with trembling hands and drew out a little metal box. Its surface was streaked with something alarmingly reminiscent of dried blood. Grada's face paled. That's nothing," he stammered. "Just junk." Sarah's gut instincts were yelling otherwise. She laid the box on the ground and took a step backward, hitting the number on her speed dial with trembling fingers. Within minutes, Mike was there, his police training on high alert. He put on gloves and opened the box carefully. Inside were a number of items: a tarnished locket, a crumpled photograph, and what seemed to be a blood-stained handkerchief. "This isn't junk," Mike said in a low voice. He turned to Grady, who was perspiring freely. "Where did this come from?" "I don't know," Grady exclaimed. "It's not mine." Mike's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that. I'm taking this in for analysis." As Mike packed up the evidence, Sarah scooped Tommy into her arms, holding him tightly. The toddler's cries had subsided, replaced by quiet sniffles. She glanced at Grady, whose face was a mask of fear and anger. "You're making a big mistake," he spat. Mike didn't flinch. "If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about." That night, the neighborhood was abuzz with speculation. The word of the mysterious box spread quickly, and everyone had a theory. Some whispered about Gradus' reclusive nature, while others recalled the strange odors that occasionally wafted from his garage. But no one was prepared for what the investigation would uncover. In the days that followed, items in the box would be connected to a missing persons case from 5 years prior, a young woman who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. A locket and photograph were found to belong to her. The blood-stained handkerchief matched her DNA. Gradus' protests of innocence grew more frantic, but the evidence was damning. A search of his property by police turned up more incriminating items hidden in the attic, including a journal filled with disturbing entries. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as the police led Grady away in handcuffs. Sarah held Tommy tightly, her heart racing. Her little boy, with his inexplicable connection to the trash can, had uncovered a dark secret lurking in plain sight. Mike came over to her, a look of both admiration and relief on his face. "You and Tommy might have just cracked a case that's been cold for years," he said. Sarah smiled weakly, placing a kiss on the top of Tommy's head. "I guess he was trying to warn us all along." The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though the events left an indelible mark. Replacing Tommy's cries became his happy giggles. Sarah found herself marveling at her son's uncanny intuition. The trash can became a trash can, but its role in exposing the truth would be remembered forever. But in the case of Grady, his arrogance was the cause of his undoing. A thought that he could safely hide his secrets right in front of everyone else brought him to his defeat. As many times as the case, the truth rises to the top. The days that followed Mr. Gradus' arrest were anything but quiet. Maplewood, with its tidy lawns and air of suburban tranquility, was thrown into chaos. News spread like wildfire, not only within the neighborhood, but throughout the town. Newspaper headlines screamed about the trash can killer and how hidden evidence had been found in an unsuspecting suburban home. Neighbors huddled in hushed clusters on porches and street corners, speculating and gossiping. "I always thought there was something off about him," whispered Mrs. Jenkins from 3 doors down. "He never joined the block parties, never even put up Christmas lights." "That doesn't make him a murderer," Mr. Patel countered. "But those journals they found? Creepy stuff." Meanwhile, Sarah became the center of all that. Strangers and reporters came to her door each day for a statement about the boy who had cried wolf, or rather, trash can. "I don't want to talk about it," she said to them, shielding Tommy from the prying eyes of the media. But inside, her mind was racing. How had Tommy known? He was just a toddler, barely old enough to form full sentences, let alone comprehend the gravity of what had uncovered. Officer Mike Dawson was equally restless. The case had been closed with Gradus' arrest, but something about it just didn't sit right with him. He sat at his desk in the precinct, poring over the files well into the night, the soft hum of the fluorescent light above him. The evidence was overwhelming: the locket, the photograph, the journal entries detailing Gradus' obsession with the victim. Yet there were gaps. Questions that nagged at Mike's mind like a splinter he couldn't dislodge. Why had Grady kept those items so close to home, practically inviting discovery? And why hadn't anyone noticed anything unusual about him before? Mike's phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was Sarah. "Officer Dawson, could you come over?" she said, the concern etched in her voice. "It's about Tommy." When Mike arrived at Sarah's house, Tommy was asleep, his small body curled up on the couch clutching a stuffed dinosaur. Sarah led Mike to the kitchen, where she poured them both cups of coffee. "He's been having nightmares," she began, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her mug. "He wakes up screaming, pointing at the window and saying, 'It's not over.'" Mike frowned. "Has he said anything else?" Sarah shook her head. "Just those words. Over and over. 'It's not over.'" Mike leaned back in his chair, the weight of the case pressing down on him once more. "Sarah, I think Tommy's picking up on something we've missed. Kids have instincts about these things." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean," Mike said, choosing his words carefully, "I don't think this case is as open and shut as we'd like to believe." Over the course of the next week, Mike began digging deeper. He went back to the evidence room, studying in minute detail all of the items found on Gradys' person. One detail stuck with him: the photograph. It was of the missing woman, smiling brightly, standing next to someone who had been cropped out of the frame. Mike sent the photograph to the forensics lab, asking them to recover the cropped section. When the results came back, his suspicion deepened. The person standing next to the victim wasn't Grady. It was another man, one Mike didn't recognize. "Who the hell are you?" he muttered, staring at the image. Meanwhile, Sarah began noticing strange things around the house. The feeling of being watched. Footsteps in the yard late at night. Once, she found a muddy boot print near Tommy's window. She called Mike immediately. "It's happening again," she said, panic evident in her voice. "Someone's been outside." Mike arrived within minutes, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered gun. He inspected the yard, finding the boot print and faint traces of movement in the flower beds. "Whoever it was, they're not here now," he said, though the reassurance felt hollow even to him. "I'll set up a patrol to keep an eye on the house." Sarah nodded, holding Tommy tightly. "Why can't this just be over?" she whispered. The deeper he delved into the photograph, a name came up: Carl Redding, a drifter with a history of petty crimes and a known associate of Grady. A quick search of police records revealed that Carl had been questioned during the original investigation but was released due to lack of evidence. Mike's gut told him Carl was more involved than anyone realized. He began piecing together a timeline, uncovering a web of connections between Carl, Grady, and the victim. But before he could act, an urgent call came from Sarah. "Tommy, he's gone!" she cried, her voice shaking. "I went to check on him, and he wasn't in his bed." Mike's heart dropped. "I'm on my way." The search for Tommy was frantic. Neighbors joined in, flashlights cutting through the night as they combed the streets and nearby woods. Sarah was inconsolable, clinging to Mike as he organized the search party. "We'll find him," he promised, though fear gnawed at him. Hours passed with no sign of the boy. Just as despair threatened to take hold, a cry pierced the darkness. "Over here!" someone shouted. Mike ran toward the voice, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the trees until he came to a small clearing. There, in the middle, stood Tommy, his tiny frame bathed in the brilliant light. He was pointing at something, his tear-streaked face contorted in fear and urgency. Mike followed the direction of his finger and saw it, a shallow grave, freshly disturbed. The police arrived en masse, blocking off the area while forensic teams worked to exhume the grave. Inside, they found the remains of another victim, one who had been missing for years. The evidence pointed to Carl Redding, whose fingerprints were found on the makeshift grave marker. 2 days later, Carl was found hiding in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Carl, in interrogation, confessed to the murder and implicated Grady Pawn in one of his twisted schemes. Grady had hidden evidence for fear. All the while, the mastermind behind these murders had been Carl. As the case finally reached its conclusion, the neighborhood began to heal. Tommy, though young, seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened. He no longer cried when he saw the trash can, but his quiet demeanor hinted at a wisdom beyond his years. Mike visited Sarah one last time, bringing a small stuffed bear for Tommy. "You've got a remarkable kid," he said with a smile. Sarah nodded, the tears welling up in her eyes. "He saved us. In more ways than one." As Mike drove away, he looked at the rearview mirror, the faint glow of the Grady house in the distance. The secrets it had held were finally out, but the lessons learned would be kept forever in Maplewood. The morning after Carl Redding's arrest, Maplewood woke up to a flurry of activities. Police cars lined up along the streets, and reporters outside the precinct, all clamoring for a statement. To the residents, The horror of what had transpired felt like a bad dream, a dark secret that lay dormant in their idyllic neighborhood now exposed to the harsh light of day. For Sarah, the nightmare wasn't over. Despite Carl's confession and Tommy's safe return, unease lingered. Tommy had resumed his normal behavior, giggling as he played with his toys, but Sarah couldn't forget the way he had pointed toward the grave in the woods, his small frame trembling with fear and certainty. How did he know? She said to her glass of coffee and the outdoors beyond the pane. That question gnawed her, a riddle she may never find an answer to. Officer Mike Dawson harbored similar feelings on skimming case files in his office. The confession of Carl came forth without any frills, that he had pushed Grady into burying evidence, then left him holding his package. It just didn't quite balance. One detail, in particular, haunted him: Tommy's role. The boy's cries and gestures had pointed to the truth before anyone else suspected a thing. Mike couldn't chalk it up to coincidence. "There's something we're missing," he muttered, running his fingers through his hair. He decided to visit Sarah's house, hoping to gain more insight. When Mike arrived, Sarah greeted him with a nervous smile. Tommy was in the living room, stacking blocks and softly humming a tune to himself. His innocence stood in direct contrast to the weight of the questions surrounding him. "Thanks for coming," Sarah said, leading Mike to the kitchen. "I've been worried. About everything. About Tommy." "I understand," Mike said. "I'm hoping you can help me piece together some things." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "I'll try." "Has Tommy said anything else about what happened?" Mike asked. Sarah shook her head. "No. It's like he's forgotten. Or moved on. But I can't." "How did he know about the trash can? About the grave?" Mike leaned forward. "Sometimes kids pick up on things we don't. Subtle clues, emotions. Maybe he overheard something, or maybe he saw something he couldn't explain. But he's just a little boy," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "He doesn't even understand what death is. How could he sense something so dark?" Before Mike could respond, Tommy appeared in the doorway, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. "Mommy?" he said, his voice small. "Can I show Officer Mike my drawing?" Sarah smiled despite her worry. "Of course, sweetheart." Tommy handed Mike a piece of paper covered with colorful scribbles. To anyone not paying close attention, this was like any child's drawing, but as Mike looked closer, a shiver ran down his spine. The picture showed a man standing by a trash can, holding something small and dark. Next to him, a smaller figure pointed at the scene, its round face streaked with tears. "Tommy," Mike said carefully, "can you tell me about your drawing?" Tommy nodded, his eyes wide. "That's the bad man," he said, pointing to the figure by the trash can. "He put the shiny box there." "When did you see this?" Mike asked, his heart racing. Tommy frowned, as if struggling to find the words. "At night. When I was sleeping. But I wasn't really sleeping." Mike left the house, the drawing folded carefully in his pocket. The boy's words echoed in his mind. Could it have been a dream? Or was it something more? He decided to dig deeper into Carl's background, focusing on his movements before the murders. What he found sent shockwaves through the investigation. Carl had lived in Maplewood years before, in a rental property just a few blocks from Sarah's house. Police records showed multiple complaints from neighbors about disturbances at night, banging noises, shouting, and most chillingly, sightings of Carl wandering the streets at odd hours. One report was more catching than the others, though. A neighbor had called in a man seen digging near the woods late at night. The police had investigated but found nothing at the time. Mike's pulse quickened as he read the report. Had Carl been hiding something back then, too? Mike went back into the woods to where Tommy had taken them to the grave. He went over it square by square, knowing they had to have missed something. Hours passed with no luck, but just as he was about to give up, he noticed a patch of disturbed earth beneath a large oak tree. Using his car's small shovel, he began digging. Several minutes later, his spade hit something solid. He dug up a metal box, like the one that had been in gratis garbage. There was more inside, a bracelet, a piece of torn fabric, and another photo. This time, it showed Carl with several men in their company, and their faces didn't look any different than stone. Mike's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about Carl. It was bigger, a network, perhaps, or an extended secret that reached beyond Maplewood. Back at the precinct, Mike presented his findings to his captain. "We need to investigate this further," he said. Carl wasn't acting alone. "There's more to this than we thought." The captain nodded gravely. "Do what you need to do. But tread carefully. If you're right, this could go deeper than we're prepared for." That night, Mike couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As he sat in his car outside Sarah's house, keeping an unofficial watch over her and Tommy, a shadow moved in the corner of his vision. He turned quickly, but the street was empty. "Paranoia," he muttered to himself, but the unease refused to leave his mind. Inside the house, Sarah was tucking Tommy into bed when he suddenly reached out and grasped her hand. "Mommy," he whispered, "be careful. The bad man doesn't like us." Sarah's breath caught. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Tommy shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "He's watching. The deeper the investigation, the greater the danger." Mike's pursuit of the truth led him to more and more connections, each one more chilling than the last. And as he pieced together the puzzle, one thing became clear: the horrors lurking in Maplewood weren't finished yet. The shadows of the past were stirring, and the battle for the truth had only just begun.